Thank you all for coming. This is a wonderful opportunity, an event for our college. I'm Sonia Hurd, and I'm the Dean of the college, as many of you know. So every year, as perhaps most of you have heard, we have the world-renowned firm of HGOR in Atlanta fund a lecture or a panel at the College of Environment and Design that is meant to engage practitioners, faculty, and students in cutting-edge environmental design discussion. This year's panel will be on affordable housing in the 21st century with a focus on the Atlanta region. And I think that we can all agree that this is a very complex topic to debate, but it is extremely pertinent, and I think it's pertinent probably to every citizen of our country. So we have the honor to have our very distinguished panel moderated by HGOR's founding partner and principal, Mr. Robert Hughes, who is, I can proudly say, a graduate of our own college with the BOA from ¡77. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce him, and I know he's a familiar name to many of you, as of course is his firm. He is without a doubt not only one of our most accomplished alumni, but also a wonderfully generous friend of the school. His generosity has come in many avenues, including he serves as chairman of our Dean's Advisory Council, which is a very important body that provides intellectual direction to the school. And he also, I have to say, created the Hughes professorships, which I have the extreme honor of holding. So, you know, the list of reasons for which we have to thank you, Bob, is very, very long. But we can take an hour and a half with that. Bob established HGOR in 1992, and since then, the firm has sought to create great, beautiful, and sustainable places, producing sound returns on investment and yielding a stewardship ethic for future generations. Through his nearly 40-year-long career, Bob has led HGOR to complete projects in 23 states and 6 countries. He is a recognized leader in innovative and sustainable design. He works closely with clients to develop powerful ideas into resolute realities. His demonstrated ability to understand and build consensus around a comprehensive vision has led HGOR to receive more than 80 professional awards for planning and design, including 23 state, regional, and national ASLA awards. So a great honor for Bob to be among us. Thank you for organizing this panel, and thank you for moderating it.
Thank you, Sonia.
Yeah.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Great. I really have a job here today that's quite a pleasure, and it's to moderate this panel of true experts that have a real interest and a passion around the issue of affordable housing. One of the things we really want to talk about today is really, do we have an affordable housing problem, or do we have a lack of mobility problem in our cities that is driving the affordability issue? It's a problem that is a national issue. We certainly have it in Atlanta. It's very, very much a multi-headed beast, if you would, to try and solve. There are quite often many different definitions of affordable housing. And so we brought a panel here together that has quite a cross-section and quite a history. And I'm going to take a minute and introduce each one of them. I'm going to try and do it briefly, but there's a lot you need to know. On my far right is Cecil Phillips. Cecil is chairman and CEO of Place Properties, headquartered in Atlanta. Cecil was born in Missouri, got a BA in diplomatic history, and he is quite a diplomat. I've known Cecil for quite a while. From the University of Missouri and a law degree from Michigan in '71. He practiced as an attorney in one of Atlanta's premier law firms for 10 years, and then started working in the development industry. He has financed and developed more than 60,000 bedrooms of student-owned campus and off-campus housing. He has built a firm that finances and helps develop and build all kinds of infrastructure projects and facilities on campuses, and has moved into providing housing for military personnel, Army and Marine soldiers. Most recently, and I've actually had the pleasure of working with Cecil on one of these projects, he has become very focused in developing workforce and affordable housing using modern modular construction. He's going to talk to us a little bit about the benefits of that for affordable housing. They're currently developing 3 different affordable house communities. Cecil, I'm not going to get all these, but he is a member and director of the board, Georgia Lottery Corporation. So if any of you are on the Hope Scholarship, thanks Cecil for that. Chairman and board of Emory Visitors, Board of Visitors. Chair of the Georgia Policy Council on Children and Families. Chair of the Dean's Council of Emory School of Public Health. Chairman, Commissioner and Chairman of the Atlanta Housing Authority. Chairman of the Atlanta Regional Board of Tech for America. Chairman of the Board of Trustees of the Howard School, and has been a member of the Council on Foreign Relations since 1997. Next to Cecil is John Goff. John I've known for many years. He is the managing principal of Da Vinci Development Collaborative and has developed almost $2 billion worth of real estate in his career. He provides the leadership and support over 35 years and is currently working with Children's Healthcare in Atlanta in the management and development of a new $1.6, $1.7 billion campus medical facility. John is also is on the board of the Atlanta Habitat for Humanity, board member and chair of the Real Estate Committee, former ULI Atlanta District Council chair, former board chair, St. James Methodist Church, Georgia Institute of Technology, national ULI mentor. I apologize to all you Georgia people. You hear Georgia Tech a lot up here tonight. He is current chair of the Livable Communities Coalition of ULI. It's a ULI council, which is focused on transit-oriented design and affordable housing. And he's been a full Urban Land Institute member for a long, long time. In the center, Denise Starling. Denise, I kidded, she said to me, I got the least experience on this board. And I said, yeah, but you're living the problem. Denise is head of Livable Buckhead, a nonprofit organization in the Buckhead area, which is focused on how to make Buckhead, by its name, a more livable place for all people. Denise had started it, 20 years ago on the transportation side with managing traffic management programs and a Buck shuttle. She has helped launch and get Livable Buckhead into the sustainability world with more than 19 million square feet of commercial building space participating in Atlanta's Better Building Challenges. And that is far outweighs any other part of Atlanta. 102 lead projects, more than 63% of Buckhead within 1 mile of an electric vehicle charger. So very much a leader in that. Throughout her reign at Livable Buckhead, they've won more than 14 awards for exemplary programs and contributions. She earned her degree of City and Regional Planning from Georgia Institute of Technology. She is a graduate of Leadership Buckhead, Leadership Atlanta, the Regional Leadership Institute, class of 2014, member of Buckhead Rotary, and co-chair of the Human Trafficking Committee. Thank you. Matt Samuelson, I might as well say it. He went to Georgia Tech and his wife did too. You know, so get that right off the hat here. Matt is serves as Chief Operating Officer for Integral. Integral as a company has probably developed as much or more public housing, affordable housing as anybody in the country, and developed in the Centennial Olympic facility, the first public-private market-mixed affordable housing project in the country back in the mid-90s. Matt began his career as in the construction world and heavy civil engineering construction, and has moved into the development world and is currently managing a project in Atlanta, which is the largest brownfield development project in the southeast of the country. Either. All right. It's the old the old General Motors plant in Doraville, which is quite an undertaking to do. Matt graduated from Georgia Tech with a bachelor's degree in civil engineering and received an a certificate of engineering from Oxford University in Oxford, England. He is a member of 2014 Leadership Atlanta class. Board service includes Fellowship of Christian Athletes, Atlanta Public Schools, Local School Council, True Colors Theater Company, and currently serves on the board of Metro Atlanta YMCA, Livable Buckhead with Denise, and Velocity Projects. And finally, right next to me is Dr. Casey Dawkins. And I'm never going to get through this list of accomplishments. Dr. Dawkins is professor of urban studies and planning and director of the Urban Studies and Planning and PhD Regional Planning and Design Programs and Research Association at the National Center for Smart Growth at the University of Maryland. He earned his PhD in City and Regional Planning from Georgia Tech. And prior to joining Maryland, Mr. Dawkins was an associate professor of urban affairs and planning for the Metropolitan Institute, director of the Center for Housing, and editor of the journal Housing Policy Debate at Virginia Tech. Casey currently his research focuses on U.S. housing policy, metropolitan housing market dynamics, the causes, consequences, and measurement of residential segregation by race and income, and the link between land use regulations and housing affordability. That's a long sentence, but I will tell you that is a lot of stuff that he has focused on there. He has written 2 books and over 40 journal articles and book chapters on these topics. And he was co-editor of 2 special issues on the Journal of Urban Geography that focused on measurement of residential segregation and neighborhood change, and currently serves on the editorial advisory board for the Journal of American Planning Association Housing Policy Debate. So please, that's a long introduction, but it needed to be done. So I'm going to kick this off with a few questions. And Denise, I'm going to start with you, since you say you don't have the most expertise. But as I said, Denise is in Buckhead, which is one of the wealthiest parts of Atlanta, but also with 19 million square feet of office space, is one of the 3 largest centers of employment in the metropolitan Atlanta area. And so Livable Buckhead has just launched this summer a study which is really to understand how does affordable housing happen in Buckhead, and how do we solve the mobility issues in Buckhead, and what's the link between the two. So what is affordable housing, and is it fair to say we have an affordable housing problem in this country, and especially Atlanta? As we just said, you know, Atlanta is a city with great wealth in it, but it has a serious affordable housing problem. What are your thoughts on this issue? And if you believe we have a problem, how do we move towards it?
So you'd think that would be an easy question, what's affordable housing? But as I've gotten into it, being from the transportation world, I've realized that it's really not an easy answer. There's kind of what I like to call capital A affordable housing, which is, you know, kind of the low income, you know, 60 to 80% of area median income and spending more than 30% of your budget on housing costs. That's the official definition, but affordable really is a whole lot more than that. And we've really grappled with that in positioning the study that we're doing, because when you say affordable housing, it immediately has a negative connotation to it, and it immediately is one where people, particularly in Buckhead, will think it's not their problem. And so we've gone really uber wonky with it and decided that we're calling our effort a housing stratification initiative, because we're not just trying to get to the very low end of the spectrum. We've got all of our housing is in the very high end, and we need the middle. So you hear a lot about missing middle in that kind of range, and the workforce in Buckhead, unless you make $60,000 a year, you can't afford to live in Buckhead. And so that's a problem. And to your point about the mobility side of it, the whole reason we actually started the housing study was we did a master plan 2 years ago, and out of that master plan, it identified housing as the major issue for us causing traffic. And more specifically on that, we have a jobs to housing imbalance, 10-to-1 for jobs to housing opportunities. But then on top of that, the types of jobs that our workforce needs doesn't match the price points on the housing. So if you think about, if you're familiar with Buckhead, you've got your major shopping malls, you've got all the hotels, the retail, and the restaurants. Those are not the types of jobs that equate to the high end of the housing value or the ability to afford that high-end housing that we have. So 98% of our workforce has to come into the community every day. So yeah, we definitely have a problem. And to give you an idea of how bad that problem is, we anticipate there's about 18,000 jobs that fall into the range of needing the sort of more moderate level housing, and there's between 1,500 and 3,500 in supply. So a little bit of a mismatch, and that's at the lowest level. That's not even looking at the middle of it yet. So all of those factors going together are really just working against each other and continuing to exacerbate the problem for us.
And I think you mentioned $60,000 to be able to afford to live in Buckhead. The average median income in all of metropolitan Atlanta is $55,000 a year. So you're above AMI just to be able to afford to live there. So it's a big problem. Casey, jumping to you. And this is, I got to tell you before I even say this, the whole policy side of this, we could talk about for an hour alone. You know, we all know that outcomes are driven by housing outcomes are a variety of factors, including markets, demographics, and cultural preferences. Yet the public sector policies play an important role. In your view, how can national, state, and local policies alleviate the problem? And I have to give you a multiple-part question here. What is the link between the current systems of taxation and land use regulation, e.g. zoning and affordability? And should the taxation and regulation systems be changed?
Thank you. And thank you for inviting all of the yellow jackets to the panel. I appreciate that. I want to start by talking about how the policies that we have sort of structure the problem in ways that create the problem. And to some extent, there are things that are unique to the U.S. I think it's sort of important to emphasize. And there are three things I want to focus on. And first, and those three things are home ownership, property taxes, and local governance. And those three things sort of work together to sort of structure the affordable housing problem that we have. And starting with home ownership, we don't really have a U.S. housing policy or a sort of a comprehensive U.S. housing strategy. What we have is a U.S. home ownership policy and some small programs designed to help low-income renters. But when you look at the magnitude of the difference between those two, it's pretty dramatic. So we spend $157 billion that we give back to homeowners to sort of incentivize owning a home through it. So we sort of give that tax revenue back through tax expenditures. Most of that comes through the mortgage interest tax deduction, but we also forego capital gains exclusion, state and property tax deductions. $157 billion is about 4 times HUD's entire budget. So the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development has a budget, about a quarter of that to spend on all of its rental housing programs. But there's also a difference between the two. So you get if you itemize your taxes, that's a sort of an entitlement to a homeowner. If you're a low-income renter, you have to apply for these HUD programs. You're not guaranteed to get it. Only about a quarter of those who actually qualify for the HUD assistance actually get it. So it's a very different system for renters and for homeowners, particularly for low income in both of those categories. So that's sort of the first piece of that. The second piece is property taxes, and I want to sort of frame that in a different way than we would normally think of, rather than sort of property taxes increasing home prices. I see it as sort of the link back to home ownership. It creates an incentive for homeowners to want to sort of use the local policy apparatus to sort of elevate and enhance the value of your home. And property taxes are sort of a way of doing that. If you can sort of vote in sort of a structure of policies that keeps rates fairly low but provides services that enhance the value of your home, so that's an appealing thing from a homeowner's perspective. But unfortunately, low-income housing is often viewed to be a fiscal burden from that standpoint. So we have a sort of pervasive problem associated with exclusionary zoning, but it sometimes is a result of the perceived fiscal burden on the property tax base anyway of low-income housing. And there's also sort of outright discrimination against the residents of low-income housing as well. And so that's sort of a second piece of the puzzle. Local governance, and one big problem in the Atlanta region is there's simply too many local governments. And so if you have higher income and you are fairly mobile, you can sort of move to the jurisdiction you want that provides the services that you want at the tax rate that is beneficial to you. You can sort of move out of jurisdictions that are providing a lot of low-income housing if you don't want to live in those places. But that's enabled by the fact that there are so many local governments and they're not really coordinated in sort of delivering housing policy. So a study, for example, that Brookings Institution did in 2006, so at that time in Atlanta, there were 20 counties and 110 cities in the Atlanta metropolitan area. I think there are actually more than that now because new ones are being created as we speak. That study found that a quarter of those counties and 22% of the cities would ban a typical apartment building, so 40 units of two-story apartments on a 5-acre lot under the zoning policies that existed. And there's sort of a relationship to the fragmented nature of government in the region as well. So those are sort of three things that they're not policies per se, but they sort of structure the housing delivery system in ways that provide incentives that sort of work against the delivery of affordable housing.
Thank you, Casey. Cecil, as mentioned earlier, I think both with your background and your active participation in developing and pursuing additional opportunities to develop affordable housing, and you've looked at some innovative ways. Share with everybody, if you would, sort of boots on the ground in the middle of it, what you see going on both in the public sector and private sector viewpoints, and some things you think we ought to be looking at.
Sure, thank you. And thank all of you for taking the time this afternoon to come listen to people you've never heard of before. The truth is the affordable housing crisis, along with the opioid crisis, are the only two real crises that I know that haven't been invented by the press or politicians. And the affordability crisis in housing is driven almost completely by costs. It's not so much qualifying income, it's just that the costs drive the price of the housing, whether it's for rent or for sale, so far above what people can pay, which generally means not devoting more than 30 to 32% of your income to your shelter costs. And that cost crisis is driven by a fundamental change, not in the prices of lumber or copper or oil or steel, tariffs or not. The crisis came about after the Great Recession, when construction costs started going up as a function of the hollowing out of the construction labor pool. Beginning in 2009 and 2010, millions of workers not only left the construction industry, they left the country, and now they can't get back in. And that's not going to change. For better or worse, the country's made up its mind that we're not going to have the open borders that we've had for so long. Millions of others during that same period left the construction industry and now have jobs in regular industries where they get a paycheck every 2 weeks, they have health benefits, and they're not coming back into the construction industry because it is so uncertain about the continuity of your job. You don't know from one project to the next whether you're going to have a job. The upshot of that hollowing out of the construction labor industry is this. The average age of a construction worker in America is 45, which means two things. Actuarially, that age is going to go up by 1 year every year. And because of deaths and retirements, the supply of that construction labor is going to get smaller and smaller. The law of supply and demand not having been repealed means that that reduced supply is going to have a higher price to have the supply. So in Atlanta today, and I'm the son and grandson of farmers and postmen, so I'm all for lower middle class, blue collar people making as much as they can, but electricians and plumbers in Atlanta today make $140,000 a year. When you ripple that number through your cost analysis, what you end up is exactly what we're getting in Atlanta and elsewhere in the country. You're getting housing, both for rent and for sale, for rich people. The 1% who can afford to pay the return sufficient to attract the developer who has to pay these higher construction labor costs. My epiphany about this came about 6 years ago, both when I was chairman of the Housing Authority and in my day job. The construction bids that we were getting were so high, so much higher than any commodity price fluctuation would support, that when I dug down into why construction costs were going up, I came up with this and discovered this labor shortfall, which is structural. It's not going to change. Moms and dads are not encouraging their children to grow up to be plumbers and framers and roofers and electricians. So the problem that I've just described is only going to get worse, not get better. That's the downside. The flip side for me was kind of an epiphany, like, okay, I know what no longer works, traditional construction. You know, so for the first time in 10,000 years, we have to change the way that we build things. For 10,000 years, whether we were building the pyramids, the Great Wall of China, the cathedrals of Europe, we did it the same way. You found the land, you brought the materials to the land, and you brought the labor to the land to put the materials together to build whatever you were building. Well, that worked until April of 1945, when the Second World War in Europe ended. Europe had to rebuild. It had destroyed its infrastructure. They knew where they wanted to rebuild. They knew that they had the materials, a lot of it recycled stone and stuff like that, but they just killed 20 million people. They didn't have the labor to come do what labor had done for 10,000 years. So their choice was wait a generation and hope that the Germans and the French and the Dutch and the English boys and girls grew up to be masons, plumbers, and electricians. You're not going to wait 20 years to rebuild. Or find a new way to build things with only 1/10 of the labor input. So they started tinkering, building stuff in factories. And like most tinkering, the first examples were nothing to write home about. But 80 years on, in Europe today, whether it's residential, commercial, or retail, if you own a building that has been uses modular construction, you have a price premium associated with it because it now has the reputation for not only being environmentally sound, but also being better built. The fit and finish, if you will, are much better than if you build it on site. So that was my epiphany. I said, okay, I can't continue to do what I've been doing for 25 years, building the 10,000 year way. How can I deliver a construction method that delivers an affordable product? And I looked at shipping containers. Don't bother. They're cute. They'll work for retail. They'll work for emergency or post-emergency temporary housing, but they're not ready for prime time for 24/7 living. And at the end of the day, even though you can buy all you want for $2,000 each, by the time you outfit them to comply with the code and insulation and everything else, you don't save any money over conventional construction. The next thing I looked at was panelization. There are problems for which panelization will be the solution. The problem with panelization is that the stream, if you will, for the materials begins in China for 95% of the panels that we use in America. China, to my mind, is an unreliable supplier, regardless of the current political environment today, tomorrow, or whenever. And since everything has to be just in time, if you have a 6-week delay caused by having to get one more permit to export that panel, then the ripple effect from a developer's perspective is that those panels don't arrive on time at the site for 6 or 7 weeks. You can forget being on time and your cost structure and the prices you're going to have to pay for being late. So it's just very, very unreliable. So I concluded about 5 years ago that until we can 3D print buildings in a way that is effective, attractive, and using something other than concrete, the only solution for modular, for construction for an affordable product is modular. And by modular, I don't mean modular components, you know, where you build a bathroom as a modular, you come and slip it in. That's old hat. What I'm talking about is a 3D rectangle that moves down the assembly line, much like an automobile or an airplane. And much like an automobile or an airplane, the 3D rectangle is built out from the bottom up and the inside out, so that by the end of the day, or the end of 3 or 4 days, depending on how long it takes, you've got a module that's outfitted with 95% of the construction that has to be done for residential housing, whether it's a single-family home, multifamily, or otherwise. That speed, because we built a single-family home in 4 days and installed it in 4 hours. There's a video that, if you're interested, I'll send it to you, of that set. It was about 25% cheaper than building it conventionally, and we built it in 4 days. It would take at least 6 to 7 months to build that house on site conventionally. And the other thing that people don't pay attention to, John does because he's had to suffer from it, but Georgia and several other states have preempted local jurisdictions from inspecting or permitting modular construction buildings. That preemption means that the local inspector doesn't inspect for construction, looking at the faceplate and making you move. The local inspector doesn't inspect every subcontractor's work along the way, which is just another way of saying delays. Instead, the state sends out its inspector and follows the module all the way down the assembly line. When the module's finished, the inspector puts his or her permit on it. It arrives at the site. The city inspector comes in, sees that, and the only thing the city inspector has the authority to do is to make sure that the utility connections inside the house, underneath the house, between the house and the street satisfy the code. In Atlanta, an inspection process that could take weeks took 2 hours. So in terms of affordability, speed, and frankly, market acceptance, modular is the wave of the future. It's the wave of the present, frankly. The major handicap that modular has is nothing associated with its merits, but with the reputation of the word modular. When you came in, before you came in here, if I asked you to give me a synonym for modular, you would have said mobile homes, trailer parks,
refab homes,
shoddy construction. And for a long time, you would have been correct. But what's happened, especially in the last 3 or 4 years with a couple of companies that we're working with, they see the opportunity to move upmarket because they now have a cost advantage that until the Great Recession, they didn't have. Because until the Great Recession, conventional labor was pricing itself at a way and at a price that modular construction didn't have an advantage that it does now. And if I'm right, and the demographics support that I'm right, that advantage in terms of cost because of construction labor is only going to increase, and more of what you see is going to be done with modular construction.
Thanks, Cecil. Matt, you know, second developer of affordable housing. I know that you and Integral have a tremendous history in building this. What do you see as the greatest financial, regulatory, and construction or other factors stand in the way of affordable housing? And what recommendations do you have so that developers become more interested in building affordable or mixed income communities?
Bob, I'm going to stay on script, and I'm going to also diverge from script for a minute. And I love following Cecil, and I love the really the innovation and share, because recently, and it's in John's hometown of Sacramento, that we completed a modular construction development that topped the market, sold for the highest unit cost ever in the city of Sacramento. And as a self-proclaimed Alex Keaton capitalist, and perhaps Lincoln Republican, may not be the most popular, I have the unique dichotomy of sitting in an office where my chairman is the current board chair of Fannie Mae. So when I hear Casey talking about macroeconomic policy, and then he also was, and we'll celebrate tomorrow night, 25 years of our business, and that was around the project that Bob spoke of, converting what was the old Techwood homes in Atlanta, the oldest public works housing project in America, Roosevelt New Deal, 1934, and in the light of the '96 Olympics coming to Atlanta, recreating Techwood Homes, the first sustainable mixed income community in the country, perhaps the globe, but it takes a global thinker to have come up with that concept. And Egbert Perry, I will try to do my best to channel, but I love a couple comments that I'm going to try my best to layer. We've got to own this problem, and we call it affordable housing. And in the firm, we've started to call it housing affordability. Your stratification policy is key because it no longer, affordable housing speaks to a segment whether we stigmatize it or not, and it's about people that have lower utility and affordability. And I love what you said, Casey, because Egbert does it better than I, but he generally, when he's speaking in a Fannie role, he's speaking to a series of business leadership, and they know that when we talk about our macro GDP, if we don't have 37% of our GDP in new housing starts, we're concerned. So 37% of the United States GDP is taken by what our housing economy is. That's really incredible when you think about it. Fannie is a $2.7 trillion company. They speak to 30% of the 30%, if you want to call it that. So we get very anxious as a global economy if we're not making new housing. Now at the same time, so he sits in that perspective, and he'll usually start a room by saying, how many people in the room, and he's Caribbean, so if my accent is following, then it's, how many people in the room live in with subsidized housing? It was a really odd question to ask, and no one ever is proud to raise a hand to say they live in a subsidized housing. And he says, anyway, so everybody. How many people are homeowners? Everyone, because everyone's proud as can be to be a homeowner. He says, well, y'all are either fools or naive, because the largest subsidized housing program is homeownership. And so we've stigmatized one, and we've celebrated the other, and the people claim the housing benefit on the mortgage deduction, and yet we shrink. And so we shrink to what the requirements for affordable housing subsidy. The reality is, to Cecil's point, to Casey's point, to the policy that Denise makes right now, we have an unbelievable crisis that will be solved by this next generation. There unequivocally will be solved by this next generation, our Generation Z, or we will fail as an economy. And that's just the understanding of what 30 to 40% of your economy means. And to the point, if we collapse the economy tomorrow, if we just make it affordable to build, then we collapse a lot of the economy. And that's a scary prospect. If we just make it more affordable for renters, buyers, and the such, then we're creating a sustainable place for those people to remain at low income. And that's also not and we solve this right now like it's a zero-sum game. We solve it like there is a way to status or get a stasis to the people that are in a block and where their incomes are. And the fact is, this is a much broader matrix conversation on how do we get to a solution. Now, going back to, we've got to strip out the regulatory, you said it, modular right now. I did a white paper in our house to be able to support our investment thesis, and it was 30% less expensive, 30% better time. By the time we were done, we spent $4 million more than conventional construction on that one deal. Luckily, luxury market rents bailed us out. We made a lot of money. That's not the story that's going to be able to suffice. Why? Regulatory, California, government, the highest encumbrance of regulatory policy probably in the world, caused us to we couldn't get there swiftly. And that was even with a factory building it that was effectively cheating outside of the Davis-Bacon wage requirement, the union wage requirement that we had, because we were building units in Idaho and shipping them to California. So I say this very transparently. We've got to come up, and you all are at the crucible of it. We've got to come up with policy that is effective at streamlining, not encumbering. So what's the biggest thing we're facing? Well, we're facing immature policy that says we're going to have a static amount of housing at a certain percentage, and we have now targeted an audience, and then we, as developers, and I think all of us would share, we start place-basing based on a demographic slice that we're trying to suffice. I think the world is actually further ahead than the United States in the way that places came about. When you're in a European city, or you're in an African city, or you're in an Asian city, density, an Indian city, density is, the solution of density has already occurred. And the place that surrounds that density is usually what makes it livable in a community for us to function. So efficiency in our domicile and the cost of our domicile, I believe, are the two variables that we're going to see help solve this. And then we better be great as planners and designers. And this is my last comment on, I'm an engineer, and designers and engineers don't always necessarily see it from the same, and the equation is going to be a design and policy-based equation. Don't ever miss as designers that you have the power to inspire. Engineers, I've never been inspired by an engineering work. Self-effacing in that. But designers have the capacity to make stuff that isn't generally attractive, wonderful. And so that's what I say, in the sense that when we get to the core solution, it's just going to be a piece of efficiency in what we live in, how we build it in cost, how we policy it in swift acceleration, and then we got to make it beautiful and wonderful, because there were ghettos in Paris, France, long before there were great high-density developments in, Prague, Czechoslovakia. And so how do you make the place that inspires you different than the place that robs a community's soul because we got there from an efficiency standpoint? So.
Thanks, Matt. Those are great comments. We're talking about subsidies in a way here, and I think if we roll back the clock and we think about how we built post-World War II and subsidies, both in terms of mortgage deduction subsidies, but how many roads, how many utilities were extended out to cheap land to build and construct things inexpensively. And now we turn around, and in most of metropolitan areas around the country, and Atlanta is a classic example of this, we made the policy decision many years ago to kill the outer loop, to start to build more densely, to make more of an urban form, and we're living and struggling through that. A few years back, probably definitely 10, 12 years ago, and certainly since the downturn and the comeback, everybody in Atlanta has said, I'm tired of being in the car 2 hours driving to and from work. So what that does is it makes a finite amount of housing, the housing that is close to the centers of employment, become very popular. As it becomes popular and law of supply and demand, prices go up. If you can afford it, you can buy your way into a short commute. So, John, with many conversations that we've had on Livable Communities Council, how does mobility and future of transit design, transit-oriented design, how does that fit into solving this problem? If part of the problem is we can't get around, so we're buying our way out of it, how do we get out of that?
Get away from urbanism completely. I think we need to sprawl, we need to take more land, build it cheaply, build cheaper costs. In Idaho.
Idaho's going to win in the end.
Actually, a couple things is, well, I have a degree in economics from Berkeley, and the great economist Alex Keaton, right? Anyone know who Alex Keaton is? Raise your hands. Who is he?
TV show?
Family ties.
That's right.
It was Michael J. Fox's character. He was this anyway, it's funny. It's a great reference.
I'm glad that I figured there would be some reference in there. Someone would catch it.
But Bob's right, and you know, from my lens, which is economist, or at least my training, my education, you know, everything comes back kind of supply and demand. And you know, do we have an affordability crisis or do we have a mobility crisis? There is plenty of affordable housing in Metro Atlanta. You can drive to places and buy a house. I mean, it's not a nice house, but you can buy a house for under $100,000. You can, but you can't get to your job. So Denise said, Buckhead's problem is a ratio of 10 jobs for every one housing unit, right? So supply and demand would say, guess what? What's the most expensive place to live? Buckhead. So transit, the intersection between transit and housing is extraordinarily important, because what you're trying to do is get people to their jobs and to their homes and back and forth again. The conundrum is, particularly in Atlanta and particularly around the country, you build TODs. The TODs become so popular that they tend to be 150, 120, you know, up to 200% more expensive than your typical sprawl place. So all of a sudden you've created an expense problem. And the people that typically live in TODs are not the people who are dependent on the transit. They, you know, they have a car or two, and they'll use transit, you know, maybe to go to a ball game, but they don't necessarily use it to a job. So how do you work your way around that problem? You know, we've heard a lot today that it comes to innovation, which is what Cecil has, and we have policies and all that, but there is a trend going on in the TOD movement, what they call ETOD, which is equity or equitable. And it's coming up with, and there's sticks and carrots to do it. There's the carrot approach, which are creating incentives for developers to do that. So a lot of the TODs are sponsored by, say, in Atlanta's case, MARTA, or other governments, create incentives for breaking down regulations, lowering costs, somehow breaking that barrier down to incentivize folks to deliver some level of affordable housing. Or there's the stick approach, which is we're starting to see in Atlanta too, which means you will, you know, if you want to be here, you will have to deliver 10, 20% of your units at 80% AMI. I can argue both sides of that, which one's effective. At the end, it affects value. But I think the point of transit is that every transit project needs to be looked at, though, with this lens of equity, this ETOD perspective. And I think it's a balance of sticks and carrots, to be honest with you. And it comes to policies. I mean, ultimately, the private sector can only do so much. Philanthropy can do a lot. A lot of progressive cities, Denver is very progressive in this. They have several development, affordable housing development funds, and they're tied to transit-oriented development, so that they're trying to work to get the affordable housing at the transit where it needs to be. Also, I can't remember if it's, I read so much of this stuff, but it's either in Denver or maybe even in Texas, Matt, certainly in California, but a lot of low-income housing is funded through a low-income tax credit program, which is an equity program, and it's based on the local housing authority. Cecil probably can talk more in that detail, but there's a scoring. So I submit my project to it, there's a scoring that goes on. We'll change the scoring, so if you're in a TOD, you're scored better than if you're in a greenfield somewhere away from transit. And probably my last point is we have stigmas around transit, just like we have stigmas around housing. And this is the part that drives me nuts, is everybody wants to be near rail. I want to be rail. Got to be on rail. Got to be on rail. A bus is a very effective, very cost-effective, cost per mile delivery, but oh, it's a bus. I'm not going to ride a bus. No one wants to ride a bus. Those people ride buses. And that's something that we got to get over that. I just got back from a trip to Europe with my daughter, and we were riding around France and taking the bus everywhere. And lawyers and mayors and everybody would just ride the bus. That's what you would do, go town to town. And there was no stigma to it. So we've got, I think we've heard this perception issue related to his manufactured housing or the, you know, affordable people living here. We got a PR problem around transit as well, because we just can't afford, there just isn't enough money to buy or build rail everywhere because it's chic and cool. So it's a complex issue, Bob. You know, a lot of people don't realize is the typical working class family in Atlanta is spending up to 60% of their income. If you combine their housing and their transportation costs, 60%. You know, economists say that number should be no more than, say, 40 or 45%. 30% for your housing, 15% for your transportation. You know, 60% is a big hunk out of your take-home pay that we got to solve, because that goes into the affordability calculus as well.
I'm going to go back, and Casey maybe pick this up, but I'll throw it out here and go back on the policy side for a second. And it's to the real estate taxation and how that affects affordability. And I want to tell a quick story and then, you know, kind of come back and do it. First two houses I ever owned were old houses in the Druid Hills area of Atlanta. I gutted them, took out asbestos, took out lead piping, took out 80-year-old wiring, fixed them up, and they were more valuable. So because I made them safer, I had the privilege of paying more taxes for having done that. Well, I had 3 small sons at the time, and next door at each of the 2 houses was a widow who had raised children and family in those homes. Within 3 years of me fixing my house up, 4 sale signs went up in their yard. I said, "You're moving? I can't afford the taxes." So we talk about affordability, and again, this is sort of we tend to stigmatize it. Oh, it's this people. It's a broad section, mixed income communities, things like that. And the word gentrification is our new modern 4-letter word. But the fear of gentrification isn't that you're going to make my neighborhood nicer. The fear of gentrification is you're going to raise taxes and I'm going to be forced out. It's a forced process. So how do we deal with that? Casey, you got the answer, don't you?
Oh, it's simple. We can solve that. So there was a guy in the 1890s, I think, named Henry George. I think he kind of figured this one out. So I don't think it's a terrible idea. Pittsburgh, so they sort of reformed their taxes several years ago, and sort of that the basic idea behind a sort of Henry George solution is to you're essentially taking the tax off of the building part of the whole property tax, obligation. So you're really just taxed for sort of your share of the community's land value. And sort of the thinking is that you shouldn't tax people for improving their property. You shouldn't tax people for building more densely. You should tax away each person's sort of share of the quality of life that's created by public investments, but you shouldn't sort of tax people from building up. So they actually put something like that into place, and it actually led to more economic development in downtown Pittsburgh. It's actually enabled in Roanoke, Virginia, surprisingly. I don't think they ever actually put it into place. In a couple of other places, and actually where I'm from in Maryland, Hyattsville, Virginia, or Maryland, tried to do this, and then the Supreme Court of Maryland said they couldn't do it. And so there are creative ideas like that, and sort of a version of the same thing is there's a whole sort of slew of things called value capture, where you can use nonprofits to essentially do the same thing, sort of purchase large tracts of land. The nonprofit sort of owns the land and then can sort of lease the land out to either renters or homeowners that want to create affordable housing on that property. So I think there's sort of creative solutions like that, and it could go hand in hand with the sort of modular construction that Cecil's talking about, I think.
What about that? From a development standpoint, if the taxation system changed, you see that as a...
The taxes are bad enough, but what really kills you are all the upfront fees you got to pay. Because, it is so counterintuitive when you have these conversations with city officials. They want affordable housing, affordable housing, affordable housing. Well, do you make it more or less affordable by charging the upfront fees that equal 8 to 10% of the total cost of the house? And of course, the question answers itself. And when you say, well, look, Right now, that site is not generating any tax revenue. But if you eliminate, say, the $10,000 on a $150,000 dwelling, and say, okay, now it becomes $140,000. Okay, then you have a $140,000 house on the lot, and guess what? It starts paying real property taxes. So the $10,000 that's foregone by the city up front, it is recaptured over time in the form of real estate taxes. So when you do the numbers on return on investment, the city has invested $10,000 of foregone fees in order to improve the value and the tax value of the house. And the payback's in 4 years. It's simple. You don't have to go to Berkeley to understand those economics. You can go to the University of Missouri, where I went, and you'll finally get it. But talking to the city officials, they're so frightened to change a structure that's embedded in their DNA and their culture. They won't do it. And so we have to go do in runs around it, you get waivers for certain things. That's rent seeking, at the public's expense. That's not a rational solution to the problem about affordability. But so far, not only in Atlanta, but other jurisdictions, when I've raised the issue and tried to do the return on investment, their eyes just glaze over.
Well, it goes to, what we're talking, it's a problem everywhere. It's the balkanization of government in a lot of ways. So the building department that's charging you the fees and all that, you may have the visionary governor over here. They may even have an Office of Economic Housing Development, and they're paying $200,000 to Denise Starling to run all this stuff over here. And she didn't even know you're over here just saying, yeah, stamp the paper. Somehow we've got to get our government leaders to kind of see this as a holistic problem. It's all of this stuff tied together.
And to your point, the development guy or girl has a budget, right? Okay, that anticipates so much income from fees. And his division doesn't benefit from the increased real estate taxes that come in from that vacant lot. That goes to somebody else's pew in the same church. Yep. So he has no internal bureaucratic motivation to think outside his box. So he doesn't.
So we say drain the swamp.
You're at a point where fundamentally we are going to discuss, I think, in the next series of 2 generations, whether our governments are going to return to facilitative agents or they're going to be keepers of the public interest. And that's a topic for the Policy Institute on the other side of campus. But to their points, we as developers find it almost laughable. The problem is so large, and we're throwing a pebble in the ocean. And I think you and I have talked about it before, Bob, where we have civic leaders putting developer funds into a trust to try to meter out to who the teachers, the firemen, the police, that's what they like to use. Well, they're all on the payroll, so let's pay them more. Because at some point we fundamentally believe that you and I are our best interest in how we create our economic outcome, but we're going to channel and bureaucratize a fund that has laden fees that sends and tries to get equity and get it down to somebody why don't we create an income instead of creating a stasis where that person has to keep at a $35,000 salary, because that is what we're going to end up fighting as a challenge at a greater perspective.
Matt, you bring up a great point. I followed 6 or 8 weeks ago. In all honesty and transparency, I'm a capitalist. I'm not a Bernie Sanders voter. But every now and then, Bernie says something that makes a lot of sense to me as a capitalist. Like, why are we, as the citizens of the United States, funding food stamps for employees of one of the largest, wealthiest companies in our country? And about 4 weeks later, he said, maybe we need a tax on those companies to help pay for this. In essence, the same thing. Wait a minute, we're not paying for it the right way. And about 3 weeks later, Amazon announced that they raised their minimum wage to $15 an hour, right? It's insane that we have a bureaucracy that manages and draws off and pays itself to take the money and handle it and then put it back over here, when in fact there are more efficient ways to do that.
think that comes back to the whose problem is it?
Yes.
Right now, all of the conversations are sort of putting the development community saying, you got to just go fix it. It's like, okay, well, why? There's, where's the problem really coming from? And I think, you bring up a really good point about the cost of development and the land cost and the labor shortage. But let's talk about, the wages. Wages have gone up 1% per year. Typically, our rents have gone up 19% over the last few. And so it's like those don't go together. And so I think one of the challenges with this topic is it's got such a high barrier to entry to just be in the conversation. And I mean, even just, listening to these guys, you got to know all the public policy. You got to know everything all of them know to actually be relevant at the table and having the conversation and being able to give a good solution to it, because it's just there's so many different parts to it and it's such a complicated discussion. And even just for Buckhead, if we make a decision or do a specific policy and put that in place, well, the neighboring jurisdiction's not doing it, so all we're doing is driving development next door. So that doesn't make sense. So where do you how big is the area you have to look at? Where do you stop? How do you bring all the different issues into it? It's a really tough conversation to even have the conversation.
Denise, that's a great point. And Casey referred to this earlier in Atlanta with our vulcanization of new cities that are going around. After the downturn, we were helping a bank who got a piece of property back understand what to do with it moving forward. It's been zoned, partially developed, so got all the zoning conditions to understand what it is. It actually had in this jurisdiction, they had gotten some multifamily zoned. And one of the zoning conditions required granite countertops inside the apartments. Now, that's legally probably not enforceable, but that is simply to drive up costs to keep a certain socioeconomic group out of that jurisdiction. I've said for years that, we still have, we have, and not to minimize the issues that we have around race continue in this country, but the biggest form of discrimination that's going on is socioeconomic discrimination. And that's the stigmatization that we're talking about.
I'm not Nostradamus, but bear with me. I'm going to predict the future anyway. And this is going to be fundamental to those of you who are listening to us. We've always, as a country, certainly since the Second World War, had about 65% of our dwelling units single-family homes. People own a home. Home values never went down. Beginning in the 90s, people used that as a way to, in effect, use their home not as a place of shelter, but as an investment. And like any other investment, it had to compete and generate a return. And for about 20 years, it did. And then the whole thing blew up. Now, the consequences, economic and psychological, of that explosion have not manifested themselves yet, but they're going to, and I think this is how it's going to happen. We're going to become a nation increasingly, not of homeowners, but renters. I'm not saying that rent is going to replace home ownership. I'm just telling you that it's going to go from 65 maybe to the mid-50s, and this is why. Well, there's several reasons. First, nobody in this room believes that home prices always go up. They've been proven not to. Second, because of student debt and other indebtedness, it's much more difficult for the people who normally buy entry-level homes to have the down payment and the credit report that's now required to buy an entry-level home in their 20s. So that home purchase is delayed. The third thing is that when you buy a home in America and take out a mortgage, you don't have any equity in that house for at least 10 years because the lenders front-end load the repayment so that most of it is interest. And they do that so that they can report it as income on their annual financial statements. And so you're paying interest, not increasing the equity of your house. The fourth thing, and this is more subtle, and I won't say sinister, but substantive. We no longer have a culture of job security in the country. So why would a rational person say, well, wait a minute, I'm going to buy this house, even though I know I'm going to change jobs at least twice and maybe 3 times in that 10-year period before I start building up the equity in the house. That doesn't make any sense. So instead of doing that, chasing that fable, I'm just going to rent while I hop from job to job to job. Because beginning in the 70s, the agreement between employer and employee about mutual trust and respect, it was destroyed. It hasn't come back. People today, I told my children, they're going to have at least 3 jobs or 4 jobs and maybe 2 or 3 careers. They're not going to be able to start at 25 and work their way up. Some will, but most won't. They're going to be outsourced, replaced, or whatever. So that job insecurity manifests itself in the shelter decision that people in this room are going to be making. And so when we start finding people who rent rather than buy, yes, it's going to be a function of affordability and qualification to buy the house, but it's also going to be driven by something much more fundamental that's changed in the relationship between the employer and the employee.
That was uplifting.
Nostradamus wasn't always right.
Could I add one and challenging chapter, and then maybe that's our cause to make sure that you all understand the challenge. But to Cecil's point, and I think it's something in developers, we are manic, and we can't stop thinking, and sometimes that's a good thing, and sometimes it's a terrible thing because we get. But add to that, and we watch the demographics shifting. The next chapter of that sociological experiment is just by physiological limitations or economic limitations. When you talked earlier about our challenge of work and worker class, we're not having children at the same scale that we were having. We're not, creating a following. We are compressing our capacity, and this isn't directly related just to the U.S. We've watched this in older societies and older cultures, Europe particularly, watching the same development curve. And when your life economically effectively is starting 10 years later or 15 years later, the fact is there's just a lot greater challenge. Are we populating, and are we creating a next sequence have we now created an entire sea change? And I personally believe we will see this sea change in the next 2 generations, and we are going to go from a fluid class of people that can create manufactured goods and housing and jobs to just having a limited workforce. We are challenged at this. So these do reach quickly to immigration policy, to globalization and fluidity and liquidity of money policy. I mean, this ranks right to the highest level of what we're trying to create as an outcome as a nation and what we mean to ourselves, but also the global economy.
This gets way out of bounds of this discussion, but the golden rule of capitalism is you work to decrease your costs while increasing your profits. That's the basic fundamental of that. And that measurement's called productivity. And so the less labor I can use or cost to build this widget and sell it to you, I'm going to do that. And I think we're going through, related to all of this, is a industrial age type of revolution of, if you think about the agricultural age and the amount of labor it took to produce a pound of food versus the industrial age versus that. Okay, well, all that labor, which was paid a wage, has gone away. So the reason wages are stagnant is because there's the demand for labor at least at the higher end is flat. The demand is at the service level, right? And
we watch that proliferate.
That's the gig economy at work.
Right, and so it's just complicated stuff. I don't know how much time we have, and we're going to do questions, but.
Take a minute here and turn it over and see if there are any questions that people would like to ask of the panelists. I see a hand coming up right over here.
So I was just wondering, what is the practicality of implementing a living wage, and how can we stop it or slow down the growing gap between wage and the cost of housing and other goods? And then what can we do as planners as the follow-up question?
Yeah, the first one is a tough one. It's policy. It goes to the swing between capitalism and socialism. how much government gets involved. I mean, if you go unbridled capitalism, it's like I said, it's, you know, we tend as a country to kind of, you know, we're not a socialist country for sure, but you look at, say, the Scandinavian countries, you know, they seem to have a balance of that where there's living wages, they have good productivity and good quality of life. And I've just never had time to really dig into kind of their taxation structure, but I don't know why it kind of works there. My esteemed colleagues may, but that's a difficult situation, but it's going to take policy, right? Government policy and dialogue to do that. I think what Bob pointed out with Bernie, you know, nailing Amazon, I mean, that kind of shamed him, if you will, to kind of kick that up. That was a pretty strong move.
And I think that's I mean, like I say, I got to hand it to Bernie. I mean, that was spot on, you know, and you're right, it shamed him into doing that. As Denise said, you know, we got to be able to get the problem out in the open and have a reasonable discussion around it. One of the things that I always loved about as a landscape architect, nature. You go to forest. If there's a forest fire, there's winners and losers in a forest fire. A tree falls down, light opens up, something else grows. It's an ecosystem that is connected together. Economics are the exact same ecosystem. And so we can tax ourselves to give somebody food stamps because they're not getting a reasonable rate, so we can ship a product to ourselves at home cheaper. Did we really save any money? We're really not getting it out into the open to talk about. So I think part of the challenge is to really understand if we as society are subsidizing something, there are people in society that need our help, right? There's a segment, and there always will be a segment of society. You know, I would like to be utopian and say there's not, but there are people, you know, born with mental disabilities, et cetera, that need our help. And we ought to be there as society to do that. But the more we can get it out in the open and saying, wait a minute, I'm raising my taxes to make Casey be able to afford to live here because he's not getting paid a livable wage. Why not just pay him a livable wage? Why not pay police, teachers?
I have a minority view about that. I don't think Bernie had a thing to do with what Jeff Bezos did. I think the market had everything to do with it. Amazon needs to hire 450,000 people in the next 3 months to accommodate all the packages they're going to have to handle. The unemployment rate is under 4%.
Supply and demand.
He's going to, the market's at work. If you want my labor, you got to pay me more for it. And that's exactly what he did, because he's competing with FedEx and UPS and all the other seasonal employers. And he wants those people to come work for him at this time of year, because otherwise his system is going to break down. So it was beautiful politics, you know, and Bernie took full, you know, that's what politicians do. And Bezos let him get away with it. But when you put aside the publicity and the politics, whether Bernie had ever come up and said a $15 an hour wage or not, he had to do something to distinguish himself in the labor market to attract those 450,000 people over the next 90 days.
All right, but your other question I want to spend some time on, which is I want to hear from the planner side of the world, was what can you do? As you guys mostly are planners, right? Yes, no, general. What can planners do, Bob? How can they solve this problem?
Well, I think some of it needs, it goes back to what we were talking about with policy. Again, if in the end market drives prices, and it will, then with that you've got the extra burden of additional real estate taxes to pay. It's going to be very difficult to overcome that. We can talk about, as planners, creating mixed income, age-in-place communities. These are all things that from a social side we value. You know, Mary and I moved 5 years ago into a condo tower. We have, 8-month to 80-year-olds in our building, right? It's great. There's a wonderful sense of community across that building. But everybody's still in a fine slice economically in that building. And so if we really want to have a diversity in our we can draw it. You know, that's the easy part. We can draw great places. We can draw big houses, little houses, density here, shape it, make it physically wonderful? Can we put in place the policy and building and business fundamentals that allowed us to build what we can conceive in our minds?
I think as a planner, this is one of the areas where it's very difficult for planners to actually change the policies the right way, because it's a financing discussion. It's not just about, our usual tools are transportation, figuring out the project, zoning, and that sort of thing. And the things that need to happen in this conversation are more about, bringing the right type of money to the table that's patient money that can take less return on investment. It's a discussion that is not what planners are trained for. So it's got to be really the development community has to educate the planning community of what works. And that's what we're trying to get at with the effort that we're doing in Buckhead is what does it take? We're approaching it from a transactional standpoint. And I think a key part of this that we're not talking about, we talked a little bit, the transportation is a huge part of this because the parking cost is a huge part of your cost in developing.
Right.
And Atlanta has done a really crappy job of keeping up with transportation investment. And great, there's probably media in the room, isn't there?
She didn't say that. I said that.
Crappy is
it's
a technical term.
It's
crappy.
surprising that I only used crappy. So
Crappie. It was crappie. Yeah.
But that's, because we don't have the transit system, you still have to have a car, you still have to have the parking decks, you still have to have all of that. And what's it, $22,000 a year to build a space?
Yeah, per space,
Yeah, per space. That's a huge part of the development cost. And I was surprised to find when we're working with employers to try to reduce, get their employees out of their cars and taking transit, it's always, the problem is always that the parking space is bundled into the lease conversation. It's the same thing on the housing side of the equation. Think about if you could rent your apartment and then have a different cost for, I need a parking space. Right. They don't do that right now. Why not? It's just things like that need to be brought into the conversation, but parking is sort of a really difficult to touch issue from a planning standpoint.
That's a bad use of land.
The next generation will solve this.
Good luck.
Have at it.
See ya.
Let me say one thing about the living wage. I've looked at it. We must be, in a country as diverse as America is, you've got to be careful what you wish for, because one size will not fit all. A living wage in New York is quite different than a living wage in my hometown of Fayette, okay? And if people are economic animals and nothing else, what will happen, and this gets back to the housing and transportation, if the living wage for New York is at a level much higher than my brother in Fayette, Missouri, my brother will vote for his feet, along with tens of thousands of others, and move to New York. All that will do will exacerbate the housing and other problems associated that we're talking about here. So the best solution for what you're talking about is good jobs. And we're not producing good jobs. There are 6 million jobs as of the last report this week that are open. They're open because 5 million of those jobs require credentials that the labor market doesn't have. And so the jobs remain open. And that gets back to why you're here, it's education. And the fundamental problem, to me, associated with our country is we're not educating men and women sufficiently to take care of themselves and provide for their family.
Let's provide a different sort of spin on the what can planners do, because I think this is sort of really important thing to think about, because as future planners, I think we often sort of mistakenly think that we're sort of capable of solving and addressing sort of every problem. I'm sort of a firm believer that there's sort of an appropriate scale of intervention for different kinds of problems, and I don't think planners should sort of have to solve everything. I think certain things are best left to national policy and a commitment nationally to certain things, living wage being one of those things. And I think certain things are problematic when you do it at the local scale because of these voting with your feet questions. So I think, sort of twisting that in a different direction, maybe a way of asking that would be to say, sort of what is the appropriate intervention for local planners and sort of what is an appropriate thing for sort of the national government, for the state, and so on. And I think sort of once you start thinking of it that way, you sort of get at what planners can do and should do to sort of address these things.
And a caveat to planners in the room. Planners are predisposed to want to get everything right and make it perfect. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. It will take too long. Even if you could make it perfect, it'll take too long to get there. And by that time, the problem will have gotten beyond your planning. Don't be afraid to try something. And if it doesn't work, try something else. It's not fatal. I mean, that's one of the reasons that we have the federal system that we've got. Experiment with things, because what works in New Mexico doesn't work in New York. What works in Montana doesn't work in Mississippi. So wherever you go and you want to be a planner, yes, planning is great. We don't want to just go off half-cocked and do something, but don't dwell so long on the planning that you paralyze your thinking and your activity. Have a bias towards action, because planning is just, if you're not careful, it'll just become a book that nobody reads. Action, try it.
We've got another question up here.
My question is for Casey. Casey, a few years back, your state, to their credit, had a pretty
Which
focused.
one? I've lived in three last.
Oh,
Virginia, Maryland,
Maryland,
DC.
current
Maryland.
state. Glendenning was the governor and had a really high profile for the state initiative to, among other things, live near your work program. And can you comment on that, even if it's still going on? Sure. And also alluding back to your earlier comment about the $157 billion in foregone revenue, we're almost a full year from the tax reform, and what's the net effect of that in terms of the MID and if people go to the standard deduction? Is it just a wash, or I'd like to hear your comments on that.
I love those questions. I'd be happy to answer. So the first question about Maryland. So if you don't know, Maryland has a sort of very unique planning law. Georgia's planning law is primarily an enabling statute, so it creates a process for planning locally and in a way that's somewhat coordinated across jurisdictions. The state of Maryland has a sort of an upside-down approach. They say, as a state, we're going to work with the local governments to figure out where we want growth, and then we're going to direct all the state investment there. And then they also had this Live Near Your Work program and a suite of other things that have some have succeeded, some have not. I've got to say the Live Near Your Work piece didn't work out quite so well. There's actually a version of that Fannie Mae tried that didn't work out for them very well either. I think really the problem is that from a lender's standpoint, sort of the savings in transportation costs from living, a little bit closer to a little bit farther away, it simply didn't pencil out in a way that made it made you a better credit or a lower credit risk. And so that particular program, I think there's some questions around it, but these broader questions of sort of coordinating transportation with housing policy, even beyond sort of live near work, there's a lot of really sort of interesting approaches, from sort of coordinating TOD and affordable housing to measuring affordable housing differently to incorporate transportation costs. So I think that's probably a better route than sort of that particular program. On the question of the mortgage interest, so I sort of followed this. This was the tax reform debate for the first time in a long time. The question of the mortgage interest deduction actually was raised as potentially something we could get rid of or scale back. There's a lot of sort of advocacy around this on either side. They obviously ended up not getting rid of it. But it led to real conversation about sort of this piece of the tax code that a lot of people just sort of take for granted. And under Obama, they actually proposed, there's a commission that proposed sort of getting rid of this. There's some proposals that sort of amount to rolling back some of the deduction and using the savings for a renter tax credit that are sort of appealing and make sense. But with the current reform, the tax reform, that Trump just passed, as I said, it still exists. There's sort of two problems. One, the standard deduction makes low-income people less likely to use it, and there is a cap, but it's still not high enough to really make much of a difference in terms of revenue generation. So there's discussions around it. It's sort of started an interest in it, but it hasn't resulted in sort of anything substantive yet. But I think that conversation is just starting, and every time the sort of housing policy discussions percolate, these things sort of always seem to come back. So we'll see where it goes, I guess.
Yes.
I know that the sharing economy has kind of been one of these almost technological disturbances, and I've heard about like Airbnb kind of affecting the affordability in more tourist destination. I was just curious to know if kind of Airbnb, if that same effect has kind of the same impact in more urban areas, kind of like Atlanta.
I'm not aware of where that's driven an affordability issue. It's created an issue of, do you have proper zoning in place to run it? So it's one thing when you're going out of your house for a couple of weeks a year and you say, oh, I'm going to put it on Airbnb and I'll rent it while I'm gone, versus people who are taking properties that are zoned the single family home and turning that essentially into a hotel, a full-time rental. And that issue, while it hasn't affected the valuations in the neighborhood, it isn't big enough or large enough to sort of come back as a sale of a property, because somebody would have to buy that as an Airbnb, different from buying it as a single family house, to start to affect valuation. So I'm not aware of anything from that.
To the municipality to get it into a channel for a hotel tax. I mean, that's
Yeah.
just reality right now. Is it works as an end around in whatever taxes go into the municipality. So
the city is actually considering short-term rental legislation right now. We are seeing it though in Buckhead. It's very subtle, but the planning department was proposing some changes for accessory dwelling that would facilitate it. And because of all the concerns over Airbnb, the neighborhood planning unit is like, no. So they're actually using the issue, they're throwing out the baby with the bathwater, trying to regulate it with the wrong tool. Accessory dwelling is something that you want to have, for affordable housing options or different types of price points. And so, but because of Airbnb and the lack of control over it, our community is pushing back against the accessory dwelling.
Same thing in DC, exact same dynamic that's happening.
we're seeing it fighting, and I thought maybe the question was going to also bridge to concepts of co-living that are occurring, and that's really another, and to the zoning laws, and you asked about what planners can do. I mean, by its nature, zoning picks winners and losers to a degree, and just ask for the property owner's entitlement back, and you'll see what they think when you talk about creating a matrix of how a good community develops. But when you think about a co-living, and we talked earlier about aging and the way that the economy is occurring for later in, well, what I lived in a dormitory when I was at Georgia Tech, and I don't know how many are, if any, are living in dormitories now in this audience, is very different on what an expectation of a student living is. And now student living looks a lot like luxury apartment living, and what's the difference moving out of that and into the next level of, or stage of life in co-living arrangements? Yet as zoning authorities, we're watching people just get scared to death because, well, you're going to bring those people, or that's going to be that kind of situation, or this is all, again, just a spectrum of, that's where leadership and planning understands these are choices. Our worst living condition in the United States is still tremendously better than whatever percent of the world, 95+% of the world. So this is a choice-based economy, and how do we get good things happening around that? And those are going to be, that sharing economy is going to be breaking down the stigma of living in places that were not traditional to our form, but are now becoming prevalent in how we solve efficiency, both at the manufacturing and at the density level.
Yeah, You know, I'll add to this. This is just out of 40 years of doing planning and rezoning and entitlement work. We would like to think that our politicians are great leaders. They're excellent followers. And they're going to do what the voters want them to do. Unfortunately, at local political basis, for the most part, 99.9% that I've seen, the political climate affords a sense of entitlement and protection and giving to the single-family home land use a measure of protection that blows anything else out of the water. What do the homeowners want? What does the neighborhood want? Sort of thing, versus what's right for the community. So when you run into these things where you see granite countertops, right? That's driven by homeowners who don't want that. And guess what? Homeowners are voters, and the politicians know whose votes. They don't think renters vote, they know homeowners vote. There's a jurisdiction in Atlanta, when Cecil was talking earlier about a shift to more towards a mid-50s home ownership. They have a standing housing policy that has determined somehow that the ideal community has 68% home ownership and 32% rental. They have a 8-to-1 jobs to housing imbalance, you know, with people driving into their community. They're one of the larger office submarkets in the Atlanta region. And you couldn't get multifamily built there today if your life depended upon it. And that's all because of the fear of this from people in single family. And I represent that demographic in a sense, in age-wise. But that's where I think, that's a holdover. Those are people who moved out there because they wanted a suburban lifestyle. And they're hanging on to it when the world is saying, we want to live in a different pattern. Including.
I see both sides of that, being that you're talking about Buckhead. And it is,
I'm not talking about Buckhead.
well, the single family mentality.
Yeah,
You know,
there
the
is
highway.
a strong contingent.
Oh, wow, because the highway was put through what was a single family neighborhood. And so it's always been the border wars of the commercial area versus the single family neighborhoods. And the city does ultimately protect the neighborhoods. That's always the number one thing in any planning work that we do. But I'll also kind of take the opposite position and say that we can't get anything done without everybody at the table. Now, that's something that is very much, the development community controls a lot in Atlanta and in Georgia in general. And, anytime we're trying to do any rezoning, massive scale, y'all have been involved in this with me, we have to bring every single person to the table. And so to your point of the perfect being the enemy of the good, we can't do anything without everybody. Yeah, and so you've got to get all of that together and bring it through. So, I mean, it's a shift in planning that, is supposed to be good planning, but it also, there are times, and I think honestly the housing discussion is one where you can't just ask the random guy at the MARTA station what he thinks about housing, because he's not educated enough about housing to have an opinion that is one that needs to rise to the level of shaping the policy. Needs to be the people who really know the conversation, because this topic is so complicated. And for me as a planner, that's blasphemy to say that, because it's supposed to be everybody's at the table, everybody not supposed to touch that. You're supposed to have all people there, but in this topic, you really just can't. So it's a really tough balance.
Any other questions? Yes.
As a designer, shifting kind of back to the housing unit, if modular is our future, then what role do we think that authenticity of design has in that future?
Authenticity of design? Well, the good thing about modular is that it brings discipline to the design process, because it's like coloring between the lines. The architect and the designer are constrained by the lines, steel or lumber, of that 3D rectangle. But that doesn't mean they can't be imaginative and original. In fact, it forces them to think more creatively, because they have to do more with less in terms of what they do, where they do it, and where they put it. My experience with architects is at first they resist it because typically, as they have for 10,000 years, they said, okay, I'm just going to start with a whiteboard or a white piece of paper and design what I want. Then the owner's going to beat me up, and then we're going to have to redesign it again because it's too costly. In modular, it's the discipline, like an airplane or a car. You got to stay within the lines, and that really represents good discipline for the designer without diminishing his or her ability to imagine and be creative. I can show you examples of modular high-rise residential and single-family that, from a design perspective, didn't sacrifice a thing.
Well, you probably should have brought some images of that. Right.
They have
When I first,
counters?
a few weeks ago,
You can
when
put
Cecil-
anything in there. You want marble floors? We can.
When Cecil asked us to get involved to help plan one of these communities he was doing, my mind was going, modular, whatever. And we sit down and he shows me photographs of them. And is anybody familiar with a sort of second home community up in Cashiers called Mountaintop? Very, very, very high end. They actually have modular units there that you can stay in as almost like an adjunct or small rental. Done with a poplar siding on them, done with beams. I mean, it's just like, that's the coolest thing I've seen. I wish I could stay there. And so to his point, you're taking this box, now it's just a constraint. I think the design opportunities are still there, and if that's what we need to do to get good shelter for people, then it's a design challenge.
Let me give you a real world example. Toyota uses the same frame, okay, to support the Lexus, the Corolla, and the Avalon. If you put the frame up, there's not a dime's worth of difference because it's the same frame. The difference is not in the physics of the supporting the vehicle. The difference is, what do you put on that frame? Do you put a Lexus with that kind of chassis and all those choices? Or do you put an Avalon with those sorts of choices? Or a Corolla with those sorts of choices? Same thing with the module. If you want, you could say, look, I don't want the least expensive Corolla. I want marble floors. I want 32-ounce wool Berber carpet. I want a Wolf kitchen. I want a $5,000 chandelier. So you're going for the Lexus within that rectangle. And you get to design it accordingly, just like the Toyota guys do. And if you want, or your customer can't afford all of that, you come down market and put something different inside that rectangle. But it supports all three of those things. So
But I
really,
want the walls to be organic. I want them to feel.
okay.
You know that designers make everything better, everything.
So don't change your major.
Frank Lloyd Wright did modular, he designed modular construction.
He did.
And the reality that we're facing is that anything from a telephone and, you know, you can go right down to the Eames chair, everything that gets designed. And if you don't believe me, my ideas, when Bob gets them, they get better. Because designers do
just
that.
told me
Yeah.
that.
And so stay there. And then the last point, but as technicians, as practitioners of design, another real world was, we are so trained, thousands of years in conventional site-built construction, that no one has figured out that the decisions that you're usually making at the end of a job in modular have to be made up here. And we're not prepared as a design community yet to figure out exactly where the switch plate is and did it line up with the light. Because usually that happens in the field, and it's okay because we figured it out midway through that they didn't, and we moved them. That has been an unbelievable, and we say it in the world of, if you've ever renovated a building, you're on go the minute you get there. If you've site-built a building, you're still figuring all that bleep out by the time you're ready to go vertical. And we don't have that. We're going to figure all that out time. And that's what, so there's a reality, the paradigm has to shift so dramatically in the way design cadence goes to a building.
In modular construction, there are no change orders, okay? You've got to think down to granular levels. What kind of door handle do you want? Because as that module moves down, you can't change your mind. It's committed. It's like the car. Oh, I want a red car. Sorry, you can have a red car. You just can't, that one can't be red because we're going to paint it black. So what happens is it requires the discipline on the front end to think everything through. You don't get a buy to say, well, we'll solve that in the field, we'll order this stuff later. You can't do it. You've got to, everything is bought, everything goes onto that assembly line, and if you don't like it, buy the next one, because that one's going through just the way you said.
Yes. Now, and then I'll get you next.
Okay. Just wanted to note Cecil's Nostradamus prediction. You really like spoke to my exact position in my life. So I think you kind of nailed it in that regard. So yeah, I'm with you. More of my question. I guess what I'm hearing is a lot of super complex, super huge issues, and I haven't really heard anything that addresses people right now with real needs. And I'm thinking of like the homeless crisis that we have. We have people. I'm sorry, I don't know your name, but I lived in Denver and was actually priced out of Denver, and that's why I'm here, because I'm trying to get, improve my life. But I was priced out of Denver, and Denver is one of those cities that has really progressive policy in some regards, but also has really violent policy towards its homeless population, and at the same time,
The homeless population is not monolithic. It consists of three separate components. The part that men and women who are addicted to alcohol and drugs, okay? Then the second segment are those who've been released from the corrections system or the mental health system. Back when Jimmy Carter was governor in the early 70s, Mrs. Carter changed Georgia's treatment of mental health patients. It was, at that time, they were institutionalized and stayed there forever. It was like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest for everybody, if you haven't seen that movie. Mrs. Carter changed all that. The flip side of that decision is that when these men and women are released from the mental health system, they often don't have a place to go, so they become homeless. So the second segment of the homeless demographic is people who've been released, not necessarily early, but released from the correction system and from the mental health system. The third segment of the demographic are folks who are just down on their luck. And most of those are women fleeing abusive relationships. They're not the people you see under the, we'll work for whatever, we'll work for food. You've got three different demographic groups. And in Atlanta, we used to have one building in which we housed all of them at Peachtree and Pine. It was a crime because the service delivery to that building and those homeless residents was completely screwed up, because the service for the woman down on her luck was very different than the person who had an alcohol or drug addiction. So what you have to do is to separate the homeless population by where they live so that you can deliver the services to them in an efficient way. And I'm talking to the guys, and there are guys, who are in charge of repopulating the homeless population in Atlanta. And my suggestion, self-serving as it is, I think it's right, is that modular construction is going to be the way to solve that problem, because unlike conventional housing, which requires a critical mass before the numbers work, I could put profitably 10 units of modular housing directed for women who are fleeing abusive relationships, and the service delivers can go exclusively to that. I can put 45 modular units for those men and women who have been released from the mental health system or the correction system, and I can put, and these ratios are about right, I can put 125 units over here for the men and women addicted to opiates or alcohol. And you solve the service delivery problem, crisis, by segregating them by where they live.
Sure. I guess a question more I'm trying to get at, I guess, are sort of more creative solutions to reducing people's barriers at this exact moment. And I'm thinking more in terms of like within municipal code, like what dwellings are habitable.
Right.
And
I think you're going to a place where you said it well, where there is aggressive policy towards holding out opportunities that exist. Bob's analogy of the lady that put the for sale sign in because she was taxed out of her home, but she's zoned out of taking someone in as a tenant in her basement as a second domicile. And those are things in this kind of us kind of reframing what we're accepting and what an expectation of housing solutions are. And that is the here and now. And I think we're racing to it as policymakers broadly. But as Denise said, it's really not the policymakers that are having the resistance. It's the people that are stuck in the heels in their entitled or entitlement, driven outcome where not against my backyard or not against my next door neighbor, because that's really where it comes. And we just got to destigmatize a lot. I mean, I think we're finding Cecil's analogies are fantastic. In 50 years of post-war economy, we're coming to the petering out of what that trajectory looked like. I don't know exactly how it manifests the next pieces, but we all can agree that we're not on the same course that we were for the last 4 decades. And these are going to be temperance issues where we may not accept a full, pendulum shift, but we sure can't keep saying that I can't rent my basement out without some sort of zoning change. I mean, that's just absurd when we think about it globally. We've got dwelling units that folks can't pay the taxes on. They have to move instead of bringing in perfectly suitable co-tenancy. It's just, those are the here and now, and we've got to get there faster because that's just a policy shift that can quickly be enacted.
Struggle with that.
And for 50 years, we built for the nuclear family, right? And that's not America today. And yet that nuclear family has as I mentioned earlier, in my opinion, a disproportionate voice still in the political arena. And so, we've got to change the tenor of that conversation. And that requires all of us. It's not just planners, but that's a community base. The community has to say, we want to have a different conversation. How do we approach this? And realize, and when I say conversation, I read a great book years ago called Dialogue. It was written by Al Yaklovic, who was a longtime Gallup poll. And he said, the difference in the discussion is, I would like a Coca-Cola. It will be $1. Here's $1, thank you. That's a discussion. A dialogue goes to my worries, my fears, my concerns. And we are doing anything in our country right now except having that kind of dialogue. Yeah, there was a question at the top.
I just had a question again about modular construction. Through that process, the design process especially, how do you mitigate or avoid flattening the community's landscape, their identity, the culture around it through that kind of construction?
Because there's not a dime's worth of difference between a modular built apartment or home that, in terms of its curb appeal or anything else, than one that's built conventionally. I could take you to, for example, to the home we built on the west side. I've tipped you off now, but if I hadn't, with all due respect, you wouldn't be able to know that it was a modular house. There's no sacrifice in curb appeal, quality, or anything else.
And they're easily done in urban, rural settings. I mean, it's geographically invariant. Oakland, California is one of the national leaders in using, actually not modular, it's HUD code manufactured units in its housing strategy. It's sort of an urban area you normally wouldn't think of as a place that uses manufactured mobile homes. It's because you can't tell any difference. They look sort of like the regular landscape. So it's a design problem, ultimately.
I guess more so my question is, when is the feedback gathered around what people are looking for with the construction or the design of the units themselves?
I'm a big believer in markets, and the market will tell you what it wants or it doesn't want. And you just have to experiment with some things. Some things you're going to get right, a couple things you're going to get wrong, but you will trim your sails accordingly. The market will tell you.
It's why as a market we're racing to modular, because it's an adaptation of our current conventionally built, as opposed to developing nations. And if you look and read and study, way ahead in printed homes. To Cecil's point earlier, the issue is a printed home has a very broad difference in context to what we're currently in an expectation. We may get there, and I think improvements in technology will allow printed homes getting closer to where our expectation is. But right now, it's fairly transparent, the difference between a conventionally constructed and a modularly constructed delivery. And to the naked eye, as Cecil said, you don't know. So markets will always drive that. And to that point, unfortunately, sometimes that's capital rising up and people buying their way out of worse outcomes. But the reality is that's what drives our current housing economy.
Do you have a question, or are you giving us the hook?
The questions that came from the students about design, and I don't for one second doubt that modular can be as beautiful and have all the qualities of conventional construction, but I speak here as a dean which has one of the best historic preservation programs in the country. What do you do about the historic fabric, and how is the historic fabric also used for affordability purposes? And I think we somehow unwillingly shifted the debate in a direction, but I think in other countries, often, there's a less of an affordable problem, housing problem, because people recycle land and buildings. They change them, it's acceptable to live in an older building, and so forth and so forth. And whereas I think there's somewhat of a prevailing attitude that if we build new, it will be better, and it's better for us to have it, and this is who we are. And I don't think that the questions of quality and authenticity are the same. Of course, you can get a wonderful Lexus, but unless it's a really vintage Lexus, no one thinks that I'm buying a car to be authentic. I mean, these are things that are connected to, different with a home. So I'm just wondering whether there is, we shifted the direction without thinking about it towards how we can add on the housing stock. And I think, we have a growing population, which is not for all countries, but we do. So it's valid to grow it, but is that the only solution?
So that is my pet peeve. I'm so glad you brought that up, because to your point of the economics of it, why are we trying to fix this problem with the most expensive solution? We're not looking at preservation of existing, and that needs to be a very big part of the conversation, because it just doesn't make sense to do, inclusionary zoning where it's all just on the new product. I mean, it's the highest, most expensive way you could do it. Why would you do that?
But the problem is this. The B and C quality multifamily housing has been the safety net for affordable tenants. This is what's happening in Atlanta and elsewhere. The A market's taken care of, it'll take care of itself. Now you're finding developers come in and bidding up B and C quality apartments, $140,000, $150,000 a door, okay? And then putting $25,000 or $30,000 a door into renovations, and then upping their rents by $400 a month. And the people who could afford to live in the B and C quality apartments, when their lease is up, they can't, so they move. So we're not preserving the infrastructure because the market says, gosh, there are people out there who will pay $400 a month more for a renovated apartment, and they will.
We've lost 38% of our affordable units in the last, I think it's 7 years.
But I think you're on to something in that the model is planned obsolescence until it's reached C, D equality, and then completely demolish and build new. I'm thinking of Switzerland as a sort of an in-between model of there's some historic shell preservation, but there's also some integration of new within the shell. There's green modification in sort of 300-400-year-old structures. So it seems like there's maybe a middle ground solution that's a possibility, but these older units are simply they're garden variety apartments that weren't built initially to have a structural life beyond 50 years.
The other thing is, in Europe, to his point, is that every country is losing population, not relatively, but absolutely. You need the demographers tell us you got to have 2.1 children born, okay, for every couple to replace those who are dying. The United States, thanks to immigration, up until the last year, has achieved that. There's not a country in Europe that has come anywhere close to even 2. Some of them, like France, 1.4. Russia's 1.2, Italy's 1.3. So it means, just like in Japan, their population is declining, and therefore the demand for new housing is declining with it. And the second thing is, unlike in America, you have 2 and 3 and 4 generations of a family not living simultaneously in the same house, but the children come home and live there until their parents pass away, and then they live there too. They don't go out and buy a new house. They live, and it's built to accommodate that. And so you don't have the demand for the new housing that you do here.
I would also add, and I love your perspective, if you all get this all the time with your dean, because the challenge is pretty high, and you have a global perspective. I just assume from having, exposure. Let's be honest, our oldest buildings are younger than most in the world, and our means, and most of which were after post World War II construction, some of it wasn't great stock. We don't have a whole lot of great stock, but to your point, where we do, it's, from a developer's perspective, it's unbelievably complicated to go from a code change and create an outcome that makes market. We demolish a building to put it up because our code restrictions require us to retrofit at a level, and then we chase and chase and chase the affinity, and it doesn't work. So when you look at making housing, so office building, office, old flat to office works. Old flat to residential, it's very challenging. Office building to residential, and just the restrictions that we have from our current mindset towards build new code requirement, which is, I think, a little bit more flexible and relieved in other economies in the globe, where you take an old stock that was well built and you grandfather it to an acceptable or technologically surpass its fire suppression capacity or do the things to keep it safe. We're not there yet. We're watching office buildings being converted to living dwellings, and it's really first wave stuff. Parking decks. When we solve or figure out, are we really going to have this parking issue, and are we going to have them be nuclear to buildings? But I look, and we all know as Atlantans, I can sit from my office and count 14 that I can see, 14 4-story decks in an urban core that would give anything to have that in density. What do we do with those? And it's easy to say, well, we've got experiments, and you all probably have had juries and design to how to make them residential. But what about when they're connected to a 50-story office building? That's really hard. What are we going to do with these spaces that we may not need? I think that's your innovation, and that's happening at the lab of academic environment like this.
But as a planner who's getting all the zoning review coming in and seeing the same apartment type of construction, which has the limited life coming in and this big boom of all of it, it's all going to be crap at the same time. And so, I know, it's all crap. But
you know what you'd want to say.
Well, it's the same wave that you saw, which is your point. So it was all the stuff that was the garden walk-ups that were built in the 70s and 80s, right? So that's the stuff that was, it's 30-year life. Look, we build buildings for a 30-year life. In Europe and places, we build them for hundreds of years.
But that's what you're seeing some of the local jurisdictions. Dunwoody just did something where they changed the height requirement, where they forced the development community to build to high-rise standards to get better quality, to prevent the kind of stick-built thing. So you're seeing some attempts to get at that. Yeah, but that drives pricing out.
The devil's dilemma, too, is, multifamily that was built in the 70s and 80s might be built at 10 units per acre. Well, that's very inefficient. So the developer comes in and says, wait a minute, we can now build 16 or 25 units per acre, and that's going to create more housing for more people. So instead of preserving those at 10 units, because it's an underutilization of the acre, we have a higher and better use. We're going to redensify it, but to do that, we've got to tear everything down and then build it.
We just had a focus group of housing developers as part of the study that we're doing, and their answer was increased density, because the more we can build more and we can spread the cost across more of the units, so we can bring the overall cost down.
We have a large master plan. I don't want to add on this. I'm so enthralled, and I'm sorry that as a panel we didn't get there sooner, because these are the innovation pieces. We have a large master plan development that's transit-oriented that Bob referenced. Bob's been a big partner for it. And we had to set a self-regulating ethos that all of our parking would be central and it would be shared to the degree we can. And the market, to Cecil's point, fights us with this because there's an exit, and some people expect, well, it's got to have this to be able to be sold. But it's been a thesis that I need it accessible, centralized, so that when it goes away, we can take that deck down and repurpose what we want to do for parking. But if I have that distributed in housing, in office buildings, or centralized, or bury it, or do all the things that have been good planning, when we have this sea change of car, and we're seeing this so rapidly, it will be a 10-year window. We want to have that real estate repurposable. But if it's distributed, I can't claim it back. I can't get it back out of an office building that was built on a podium, or a wrap that was enclosed in or it was a centralized, or I can't unbury it. Those are the things that we've had to hold as planners and as developers, things that are future-proofing to a degree.
And I'm taking a big risk on what I'm doing at the MLK MARTA station downtown. It's 308 units, 100 of which are reserved for affordable. The big decision I've made, though, is that we are underparking significantly what you would otherwise expect in a 308 unit development. It's going to be less than one parking space per unit. And that's driven by two things. I think that the world is changing about transportation. And as a developer, the last thing I want is 5 years from now is to have 100 $25,000 parking spaces that I can't do anything with. Okay, I can't sell them, I can't do anything with them. That's really going to mess up my numbers. The other thing is that the changes are that the way we get from point A to point B, especially among the generation of the men and women in this room, car ownership is going down. Uber and Lyft aren't going away. And one of the fascinating statistics that I've been reading over the last 3 years, for the last 3 years, the number of driver's license issued to 16-year-olds in this country and this state is in a free fall. So unlike me, I made my father drive into town when I was 16 to get my license. It was a rite of passage. I had to do it. But now you read the papers, and even the automobile manufacturers are saying, wait a minute, we're going from producing and manufacturing automobiles, we're really going to become a service provider. And the service that we're going to be providing is transportation. That's a complete sea change from the way they've been thinking since Henry Ford and the Model T. And I'm betting real money that will be right, and that 5 years from now, I'll probably be overparked, but not by 100, but maybe by 20 or 30. So don't let me down, okay?
So I'm going to pause, at least pause us here for a minute. We're now officially a little over 1 hour longer than we were supposed to be here. I think you can see that this group could sit here and talk about this. I think the conversation has gone a lot of different directions. I think first I want to thank each and every one of our panelists for giving us their time to come and talk. And secondly, just say to everybody, as you can see, this is not a simple yes or no answer. It's complex. It's complex with how we grow and live our cities. But I do think that, as we touched on here, this is a decision on how we as society want to address a problem and start to voice that. And when we do that and we come to the table the right way, we'll touch on all the complexity of this and we'll find a better answer than we've had. So thank you all for coming. We appreciate it.
Thank you.